This is the first lecture for Wednesday, April 1st, where we're continuing our discussion of community ecology. We've looked at patterns of diversity, the fact that some communities are more diverse than others, and how you actually go about demonstrating diversity. A number of different indices that people have used. Some people came up with their own diversity index, some similarity indices, some differences between communities, some comparing different communities, some monitoring a certain community over time. And so realizing that there are these differences in diversity amongst communities around the world, we're going to look at three different features of things that influence diversity. We looked at some of these, how much energy there is and how much opportunity there is for different niches to be filled, those kinds of things. But there's some explanations for patterns in a more philosophical way, rather than just looking at a gradient of something like solar energy. So we're going to look at disturbance and the thought of how disturbance is related to community diversity. Well, also, after this section, we're going to look at succession, these patterns of changes within communities, and this disturbance, this idea of disturbance, has a lot to do with succession. There's also natural enemies, and then there's the different thoughts about equilibrium that you find in communities. That also is going to be related to succession. So first of all, disturbance. There's a number of communities out there that are relatively stable, but a more common experience for these communities is that they experience some level of disturbance. That might be every 100 years, it might be every 5 years. There's different types of disturbances. Some rapid change that can affect communities, and there's other more gradual change. There's things like floods, forest fires, landslides, these big physical disturbances to a community, and then that community is altered. And so, as I mentioned, there's different schools of thought in terms of how disturbance is related to the diversity that you find in communities. That's what we're focusing our attention on, is diversity. Now, some of these things that we're going to look at, disturbance and natural enemies, and some of these other things are certainly going to be related to succession. But for now, we're looking at diversity. Why is some community very diverse, and why is another community not very diverse? And even within a community, within one community, why does this level of diversity change over time? So you can imagine if there's some kind of a disturbance. At first, maybe there's not very many habitats to be occupied. At first, maybe it's a harsh environment. But certainly with some kind of disturbance, it resets the clock. It resets the conditions in this community and offers some new niches to be filled, that offer some new opportunities. So there's new conditions potentially to be occupied by new species. And it could be one of the factors that explains the level of diversity that you find in a community, or certainly the pattern of change in diversity that you find in a community. So there's this idea of there's different levels of disturbance. Now, some communities can experience often and short time intervals between disturbances. And so if you think about how often a community can be disturbed, you can have low rates of disturbance, you can have high rates of disturbance, and then somewhere in between, you have intermediate rates of disturbance. And there's a hypothesis about this intermediate level of disturbance that leads to high species diversity amongst communities. So if we look at these three different possibilities, this is like the three bears, Goldilocks and the three bears, with the porridge is too hot, it's too cold, it's just right. Well, this intermediate rate of disturbance, it is the one that's just right. So low rates of disturbance. A community is relatively stable, and over time, these species interactions result in some dominant species, which, as you might imagine, could tend to reduce the diversity that you find in a community. Over time, somebody wins out. And so the number of species isn't maximized, it's dominated by a few species, or lower species diversity than would be experienced under other conditions. Now, if there's high rates of disturbance, then it's not a stable environment. It's a difficult environment for a lot of different species. And so if you're a weed, or when we looked at our at life history characteristics, those stress tolerators or R-selected species, those kind, then those are good conditions for those types of species. And you might have a number of different species that fall into that category. But for the species that require more stable conditions, then you're not going to find very many of those. And so you find these weeds, you find colonists, R-selected species, stress tolerators. And so the number of species, or in other words, the species diversity, is lower when a community experiences high rates of disturbance. Right in the middle, somewhere in the middle, this intermediate rates of disturbance, then there's some opportunity for colonists, but they don't lose out over time because there's some disturbance that takes place eventually. So you don't get to the point of climax communities that we'll look at later in succession. You've got good competitors and you've got good stress tolerators, colonists, both. You have some opportunity for both of them to persist in a community if under these conditions of intermediate rate of disturbance. And so what that translates to is more species. Here's a way of looking at this that's similar to that figure that was in the last slide, where if you have an intermediate rate of disturbance, then you have the highest level of diversity within a community. Frequently disturbed, then the long-term conditions aren't good for species that require stable environments. Maybe they're good competitors, but they're not good at reproducing under these stressful conditions, with these initial opportunities. And rarely disturbed communities, then you have some species win out, they crowd out the other ones, they outcompete the other ones, and you have a reduction in diversity. So right in the middle, somewhere in the middle, and along this continuum, it's where you find a lot of communities. Most communities aren't stable for thousands and thousands of years of some kind of disturbance. And as I mentioned, after this topic of community diversity, we're going to look at succession, these patterns of how communities change. And we're going to see this incidence of disturbance within communities and the response to that. Another thought about what influences community diversity has to do with the number of enemies or predator-prey interactions. Now, we spent a considerable time looking at this earlier in the semester, a little while ago, when we were looking at the ability of one population to affect another one, whether you're talking about the predator affecting the prey, or you're talking about the prey affecting the predator. Well, what natural enemies do, or in other words, predators, as we've looked at this, they reduce prey density, and as a result of that, they decrease competition between prey, or in other words, it provides an opportunity for multiple species of prey to occupy a community. When predators are removed from different communities, either on purpose or oftentimes for some other reason, that we don't want to get eaten by lions or tigers, or we don't want our the predators attacking our sheep or cattle. There's been a number of times in a number of different continents, a number of different ecosystems, where top predators have been removed. They've been killed. They've been systematically hunted, or they've been hunted for other reasons, or habitat destruction. But if you look at what happens to predator populations in these different ecosystems, well, the predator population goes down. And a result of that, there's opportunities for specific prey to do well. They're not being eaten, so the population increases rapidly. Sometimes it explodes. So as a result of that, you've got this one species that outcompetes the other ones, and you have a reduction in species diversity within that community. Of course, the predators population is declining, but it has big influences on the prey population. And in a little while, at the end of this section on diversity and the influence of diversity, or the community diversity, what explains community diversity, we'll look at a number of different roles that species have in a community. One of those is a keystone species. So some of this is one of the ways where you demonstrate what a keystone species is. If you remove a species and you see these, even if the species isn't that abundant, but if it's removed from a community, it can have widespread effects on that community in terms of how the population of prey are affected. So you might have 20 different prey species that are occupying a community under normal conditions when this predator is there. If you remove this predator, then you might have a big shift. Most of the prey don't do very well because they're crowded out, they're outcompeted by one particular prey, so the community diversity declines. Here's an experimental example of this. Then in the intertidal ecosystems of the west coast of the United States, among other places, this idea to demonstrate how natural enemies can affect community diversity, or the number of species in a community. So starfish are these common, important predators in tide pools and intertidal ecosystems in the rocky shore. So there was an experiment that was done to remove a number of different predators, mostly species of starfish. And as the predator density went down, the species diversity in this community went up. So if you look at that graph there that has species diversity versus predator density, then these starfish were experimentally removed from the intertidal ecosystem. Somebody went there and took them out. And so there are different levels of predator density, from high density to low density. We've done this a lot of times. Humans have, not with starfish, but with wolves and with other big predators, lions, leopards, and different predators around the world in different ecosystems, either intentionally or unintentionally. But in this case, getting back to these starfish, they feed on a variety of different prey. And so if you look at the species diversity in terms of their prey, there's bivalves like clams and things like that. There's whelks, there's chitons, limpets, barnacles, and mussels, which are also bivalve mollusks. So that's what you typically find there. As you reduce the density of these starfish, then if you measure the species diversity over time, the effect that had was that it reduced the species diversity by almost 50%. It cut it in half, pretty much. And the explanation for that was because this one prey, mussels, and another prey, the barnacles, they did much better than the other prey in the absence of these starfish, or under conditions where the starfish density was reduced quite a bit. Mussels did very well, barnacles did very well. They outcompeted these other prey species. And so the diversity, however you measure that, we looked at a number of different measures of species diversity, but just the sheer number, if you're just talking about species diversity in terms of species richness, the number of species declined because of the removal of these predators and the decline in the predator density. So there's some natural situations where some predator has been removed for one reason or another, not because somebody was conducting an ecological experiment, but because they wanted to shoot a bunch of wolves or coyotes or some predator because it was preying upon their livestock, or because some other reason that was dangerous to humans, or there's some removal of predators that are basically a natural laboratory to examine this, and there's some other experimental ones where some ecologists went out and purposely removed the starfish to see what would happen. Well, another thought that is related to this idea of why one community is very diverse and another community isn't, how this diversity changes over time, is this idea of equilibrium. And there's basically two schools of thought in terms of how communities change over time in relation to disturbance, how they recover or respond from disturbance, and how often this disturbance is, how much a part of this disturbance is part of the pattern of community disturbance. So we'll look at two different thoughts, two different models, basically. There's the equilibrium model of community structure, where it's basically described as a balance of nature, that there's some disturbance, and then in response to that disturbance, or after that disturbance, and a community changes in sometimes a very, very predictable way until it reaches a stable state. There's certain members of the community that are found in different levels of abundance, and that species composition in a community is maintained for a long time. So in other words, this is another thing that we're going to look at when we look at succession, but you reach a climax community where there's these competitors, there's oak trees that are the dominant species, or some species is the dominant species, and that's how conditions are for a long time. These K-selected species that do well. Another way of referring to this is the superorganism view of community structure. Then there's the non-equilibrium model of community structure, where there's changes take place all the time. There's disturbance, and then there's some response to that, and there's another disturbance, and there's another disturbance, and rather than this community being defined by a succession and a climax community and a stable community, well, the pattern is that there's changes that take place all the time, and communities are actually unstable, and everybody is looking out for themselves. You've got a little tree, you've got a little plant, you've got a little animal, you've got an insect, you've got a bird. Everybody is responding to these disturbance changes differently. And so you've got this constant change of community structure over time. And it's not so much this predictable and stable pattern that you find. And so you have succession that takes place, but as that succession, climax community is established, there's a disturbance, or along the way towards that climax community, there's disturbances that take place. Another way of describing this is the individualistic view of community structure. So let's look at these two in a little more detail, and we'll be done with these different explanations for community diversity that's observed around the world. Well, the equilibrium model, first of all, that there's these interactions that take place: competition, predator prey, competitive exclusion, character displacement, those things that are related to filling niches in a community. That given time, a community is going to be organized in a certain way, and the community structure and the diversity within a community is going to reflect all these different interactions. And over time, and given enough time, communities are going to reach this point where they're highly organized as a result of all these interactions that are taking place. The winners of competition have become more and more abundant. They've staked out their location in this community, and you can eventually have this equilibrium that's reached where a balance has taken place. All these interactions have resulted in a community being a certain way. So, in other words, a community has reached an equilibrium as a result of all these different interactions that have taken place over time. On the contrary, is this idea that communities hardly ever reach an equilibrium, and the pattern that you see within communities in terms of these interactions that are taking place and the resultant equilibrium is that there's disturbance after disturbance after disturbance rather than equilibrium that's reached. That's what you tend to find in communities. So if you go out and look in communities, over time you see this one species is competing with another one. There's 5 or 6 different species that are competing. There's predator-prey interactions, and there's these environmental changes that are taking place. Certain amount of primary productivity in water and nutrients that are available. But these interactions are changing all the time, and they're progressing to a certain point, and then there's some disturbance, and then it goes back to this baseline. And so you don't have an equilibrium that's reached. Rarely do you have an equilibrium that's reached, but along the way towards this equilibrium, there's a disturbance, and so the pattern that you see in terms of disturbance and response to disturbance within communities, and in terms of species diversity, is more reflective of non-equilibrium interactions that are taking place, and equilibrium is never reached. Okay, well, next we'll look at patterns of species diversity, but we can do that in the second lecture.